Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 13, In Adam's Fall, We Sinned All. Today, we're going to close out this series of episodes with a look at the broader sweep of New England's history from the late 1630s to the 1670s, bookended by two wars against the Indians, the Pequot War and King Philip's War, which was possibly the deadliest war in American history, at least in per capita terms. But first, the Pequot War. The story begins in 1636, around the same time that the antinomian controversy of Anne Hutchinson was breaking out. In the Connecticut Valley, the Pequot tribe began to aggressively expand its territory outwards, and violent encounters with the Puritans increased. One English trader was flayed and dismembered alive by the Pequot. Towns came under attack and residents were killed or taken captive. After John Winthrop became governor of Massachusetts again and dealt with the antinomians, the colony began to move against the Pequots. Plymouth and the Connecticut colonies joined in as well. It didn't take long for them to inflict a major defeat. In May 1637, Puritans attacked and set fire to a fortified Pequot town along the Mystic River, burning the inhabitants alive and shooting anyone who tried to escape the flames. According to one Puritan soldier at the massacre, quote, "We were like men in a dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongues with singing. Thus we may say the Lord hath done great things for us among the heathen, whereof we are glad. Praise ye the Lord." At least 400 Indians were killed, which horrified the Puritans' Native American allies, who were used to a style of warfare based around raids rather than massacres. The Pequot fought on a little while longer, but the Mystic Massacre had been enough to break their spirits, and they soon surrendered. Those who didn't were hunted down and captured or killed. Within a few years, Puritan supremacy in New England had been established. The Pequot War is also responsible for the first confirmed instance of enslaved Africans in New England. The Indians had been enslaving each other since well before the Pilgrims arrived, but this was something new. The men and boys that had been captured by the Puritans during the war were considered by the colonists too dangerous to be left in Massachusetts, so they were instead enslaved and shipped down to the Caribbean, in exchange for African slaves who were sent back to New England, which was an almost certain death sentence for the Indians, given the high mortality rates in the Caribbean. This sort of exchange became common practice for a time. Because Boston became a center for merchants and trade, many New Englanders became intimately involved in the slave trade, and slaves were often carried across the Atlantic on New England ships. Slavery was by no means condemned by the Puritans. In fact, they found specific biblical sanction for the practice, and the laws they passed, authorizing and regulating slavery, specifically cited, quote, "the law of God, established in Israel concerning such people." There was even a supposed biblical justification for racial slavery, the curse of Ham. If you're familiar with the Bible, you may remember Ham as one of Noah's sons. There's a story about Ham which takes place after the waters of the flood have receded, and Noah and his family have left the ark and returned to dry land. At some point after this, Ham sees his father, Noah, drunk and naked, and tells his brothers about it. For this act, Noah curses Ham and some of his descendants. It's a rather peculiar biblical passage, and that's all there is to it. But later on, scholars sometimes interpreted this curse as blackening the skin. Africans were thus the, quote, "sons of Ham," cursed by God to have dark skin and to serve the other races. There's no real biblical support for any of this, but it was a common enough idea a few centuries ago, although not universally accepted. There was some unease with the practice here and there, but there was nothing like an abolitionist movement. In 1652, Rhode Island passed a law limiting enslavement to a period of 10 years rather than for life, but even that wasn't enforced. Every colony in New England had at least some slaves. But although they were happy to profit from the slave trade, New England itself never became a full-on slave society in the way that the southern colonies did. Without big plantations, it just made less economic sense. In the 1670s, for instance, there were fewer than 200 slaves in Massachusetts. However, those numbers did grow over time, thanks to the slave trade and also to the slave ownership of middle-class men like lawyers, doctors, and ministers. Rhode Island slowly came to dominate the slave trade in New England, and so the enslaved population was highest there, peaking at 11.5% of the population in the 1750s. However, that was atypically high. In Massachusetts, the highest number was 2%. But for comparison, in South Carolina at the time, 2/3 of the population was enslaved. Because Massachusetts had less to fear from slave revolts, their slave laws were less harsh than those in the South, though they were hardly gentle. There were strict punishments for anyone transporting slaves out of the colony without permission. Even just buying from or selling to a slave could be harshly punished. Free blacks were also discriminated against. In Connecticut, any black who tried to hit a white would receive 30 lashes. Curfews were imposed on both blacks and Indians. In Connecticut, there were special restrictions placed on blacks buying land and running businesses. Massachusetts in 1705 passed laws against sexual relations between blacks and whites, punishing both parties with whippings and shipping any slaves involved out of the province to a likely death in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. There are apparently no records of blacks voting in colonial New England, though it can't be totally ruled out. Beyond slavery, the end of the Pequot War wasn't enough to eliminate threats to the Puritan colonies. There were other powerful tribes like the Mohawk further out, not to mention the French up in Quebec and the Dutch down in New Netherland, all of whom could threaten New England. And so the colonies began to consider some sort of union. There aren't too many details of how it was formed, but in 1643 they created the United Colonies of New England, also known as the New England Confederation. Rhode Island and Maine, which was still independent at this time, were both excluded because their religion and culture were too dissimilar. So the New England Confederation wound up consisting of Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. But the Confederation wasn't a political union, it was just a close military alliance. The 4 colonies agreed to pool their resources in proportion to their populations. A commission of 2 men from each province would oversee wars and peace treaties, that sort of thing. If 6 out of the 8 commissioners couldn't reach agreement, then the matter would be referred to the general courts of each colony, and no colony was allowed to start a war on its own. In practice, though, the Confederation never really did much. There wouldn't be another big war for decades, and so the machinery of the Confederation was allowed to rust. Massachusetts just ignored it when convenient, and that pretty much rendered the whole thing null. The colonies would remain allies, just in a more informal sense. Still, the relative unity is a stark contrast with the persistent discord between Virginia and Maryland. 2 centuries later, John Quincy Adams called this alliance, quote, the model and prototype of the North American Confederacy of 1774. Which is probably an exaggeration, but it is still a noteworthy start to formal cooperation between the colonies. It was around the time of the creation of the New England Confederation that the English Civil War was breaking out. Whereas the Chesapeake was strongly royalist, New England was, unsurprisingly, just as staunchly parliamentarian. They watched with glee as Parliament gradually gained the upper hand. These victories also had the effect of stopping the flow of Puritans out of England. Why struggle in some foreign land when you can fight for the true faith here at home? In fact, not only did the Great Migration stop, it went in reverse. 20,000 migrants had come to New England in the 1630s, but in the 1640s, thousands went back to the mother country, some to fight for Parliament, some because the war was harming the economy of Massachusetts. Few of the Puritans yet had much of an attachment to America, other than as a refuge from the iniquities of the Old World. The creation of Cromwell's Republic didn't change much in New England. The colonies went on governing themselves much as before. They could breathe easier knowing that an ally ruled in Britain, that's all. But the happy times of Cromwell's protectorate came to an end soon enough. The restoration of Charles II shocked New Englanders the same way the beheading of Charles I had shocked the Southerners. But as it turns out, they didn't have that much to worry about. We've already seen how Connecticut and Rhode Island managed to secure recognition from the Crown. There was some interference in the way things were done, but only some. In Massachusetts, according to Paul R. Lucas, the Restoration split politics into 3 factions. The first was a small group of royalists. These were merchants and newcomers to the colony, who disliked the way things were run and weren't members of a Puritan church. They were few in number and they had no votes and little power. But the 2 main groups were, in his terms, the Commonwealth faction and the Moderate faction, of about equal size. The Commonwealth faction wanted as much independence from England as possible, arguing that the Charter of Massachusetts had made them more or less fully autonomous. The king owned the colony, but that was the extent of their allegiance. The Moderate faction, on the other hand, wished to balance the independence of Massachusetts with respect for the Crown. They worried that the Commonwealth faction's more extreme language would actually lead to a harsher crackdown from England. Apparently there were no particular social distinctions between the two groups in terms of wealth or things like that, just ideological differences. Right after the Restoration, the delegates to the General Court were mostly Commonwealth men, as was Governor John Endicott, while the magistrates were mostly moderates. The two sides tussled over the proper response, but the moderates came out somewhat on top, and the mission they sent to Charles II was conciliatory. They mollified the king somewhat, but he still sent a series of demands back to Boston. Rumors flew throughout the colony that the king might take over their militias or install a royal governor. The actual demands were less extreme than that. For one thing, he wanted Massachusetts to allow proper Anglican worship to those who wanted it. Most importantly, he wanted changes to the voting laws so that non-Puritans could vote. But this still reopened the Commonwealth moderate divide. The moderates tried to stop all the rumors of royal takeover by having the king's demands read in public, but the Commonwealth faction blocked this in order to keep people agitated. The moderates hoped to compromise with the Crown's instructions, but the Commonwealth faction rejected any actions which acknowledged that the king had any power over them beyond what was stated in their charter. The debate between the two sides was ultimately about sovereignty, an issue which will only become more important throughout the rest of colonial American history. The Puritans were intensely concerned with who was actually in charge, even if the specific issues at hand were relatively minor. The settlers could live with tweaks to their voting system, but acknowledging the king's authority to do as he pleased might invite worse changes in the future. That's what the real debate was about. Anyway, some time passed without any action being taken, and in 1664, a few supporters of the Commonwealth faction were elected to the magistracy, giving them full control of government. The Crown then took more forceful action. Charles sent a force of several hundred troops to Boston, partly to help in the conquest of Dutch New Netherland, but also as a threat to the colonists of Massachusetts. This was enough to cow even the Commonwealth faction into submission. They certainly knew they couldn't win any war against the king. So the General Court complied with the king's demands. Sort of. Now, non-Puritans could get a certificate from their local minister confirming that they were properly religious and morally upright, and thus be admitted as freemen. But in practice, very few men got those certificates, and so the real impact was limited. But then they made a bunch of symbolic gestures aimed at the king, threatening the death penalty for anyone supporting, quote, the alteration and subversion of our form of polity or government, for instance. But this went too far. The Commonwealth faction was in the ascendant, but not for long. Although the people of Massachusetts were fearful of royal intervention, they were also fearful of provoking said royal intervention. The arrival of a very threatening letter from the king, which threatened to reconsider their charter, turned things around. In the election of 1665, the moderates became a majority of delegates. Normal turnover in the General Court was about a third each election, but this time the turnover was over half, indicating a significant change. The moderates tried to come up with some compromise position that was properly submissive to Charles while maintaining their sovereignty. They had a hard time of it. Commissioners of the king protested that the laws were still unfair and biased against non-Puritans. They demanded that further changes be made. It appeared that the colony was about to get squeezed, but other wars drew the king's attention elsewhere, and the demands were eventually dropped with no further action taken. So in the end, things in Massachusetts were mostly left as they were. With the issue resolved, both the moderate and Commonwealth factions dissolved, since there weren't any other concerns to hold them together. Neither group was a formal political party. There would have been cliques and friendships and temporary political alliances, but none of it was institutionalized yet, here or anywhere else. Factions just came and went. The English authorities also made similar demands on the other New England colonies, who also begrudgingly only sort of complied. In particular, the king wanted them to move towards having property restrictions for voting, rather than religious restrictions. Things were slowly shifting in that direction, but it would take a few more decades for the change to play out. By the way, as property qualifications became more common, so did fraud to bypass those qualifications. For instance, one common trick was to temporarily buy some land in order to meet the requirement and then give it back as soon as the election was over. The colonies had various statutes in place to prevent this. In Rhode Island, you had to swear an oath that you hadn't bought land just so you could vote, and in Massachusetts, the value of your estate had to be signed off on by the selectmen of your town. Which shows at least that elections had become important enough to be worth cheating for. But overall, the Restoration hadn't changed the voting system all that much. So that brings us to the 1670s and King Philip's War. In the 5 decades since the Pilgrims had landed at Plymouth, the lives of the Puritans and the Native Americans had become thoroughly intertwined. Peace had generally prevailed, at least after the Pequot War. Trade between the two groups was brisk, and Indians quickly became adept at hunting with English rifles. Puritans hired Indians to work as farmhands. The Bible was translated into the local Massachusetts language and printed. A few thousand Native Americans lived in towns set up by missionaries, but most were still unconverted. Harvard had set up a college to teach the Indians, although few attended. They were still two very separate peoples. There was no real intermarriage, for instance, but their cohabitation had gone better than in the Chesapeake at least. Or at any rate, tensions were manageable. And yet there were problems. For instance, wampum. Wampum was a currency made from shells, which were turned into carefully crafted beads. The Indians in the region had long used wampum, and after their arrival, the Puritans started using it as money themselves. Previously, the supply of wampum had been naturally limited by the difficulty of making it, but the introduction of iron tools made it much easier to produce wampum in greater quantities, which led to an increase in the supply and thus to inflation, causing economic woes. And the English settlers kept buying up native land. Unlike further south, the Puritans often actually made sure to pay the Indians at least some amount of money for their land, but the end result was still the same: marginalization. Europeans now outnumbered Indians in the region by perhaps 5 to 1, and the disparity was growing. Land kept getting sold off, and the Indians kept getting forced into smaller areas. The problem was especially acute in Plymouth, the tiniest of the colonies and the one with the least room for expansion. Plus, recent governors of Plymouth had been less sympathetic to the plight of the Indians than their predecessors, now that they had the upper hand. More than anywhere else, the natives there found themselves squeezed with nowhere to go. Enter Metacomet, or King Philip as he was known to the English. Metacomet was the son of Massasoit. Massasoit was the guy who had made an alliance with the Pilgrims and come to dominate the tribes in the region as chief of the Wampanoags, all the way back in the 1620s. That alliance had dissolved, but Metacomet was still the sachem, or chief, of the main tribe of the Wampanoags, the Pokanokets. Metacomet greatly resented the English presence in Plymouth and in New England. The Indians were still losing land at a prodigious rate. The Pilgrims humiliated him personally and repeatedly, weakening his position as leader. Plus, his older brother had died in mysterious circumstances, and Metacomet blamed the English for his death. In the early 1670s, he began to consider taking action. He felt out other tribes for alliances and sold off more land, using the proceeds to buy weapons. He probably still hoped to avoid a conflict, but he was preparing for one. In the event, war was kicked off by the death of an Indian interpreter named John Sassamon, who had adopted Christianity and was friendly to the English. He had even gone to Harvard. In 1675, Sassamon tried to warn Josiah Winslow, the governor of Plymouth, that Metacomet was planning an attack, but his accusations were dismissed. A few days later, Sassamon's body was found under the ice of a frozen pond. No one was sure what had happened, but a single dubious witness accused 3 Indians, including one of Metacomet's main advisors, of murder. They were found guilty by a jury of both Pilgrims and Indians, and they were executed. This offense prompted Metacomet to begin his long-considered attack. He launched a series of raids on Puritan towns, killing, burning, and taking captives. Many different tribes joined in the fighting, though not under Metacomet's central leadership. In response to these attacks, the Puritans revived the New England Confederation. Rhode Island remained officially neutral, although it came under attack a few times. The Puritans also had the support of a good number of Indian tribes as well, including the Pequots this time. Very quickly, all of New England was at war. Even one of the old refugee parliamentarians got in on the fighting. You remember them, they were the 3 men who had fled to Massachusetts and then to New Haven to escape the king's wrath. Well, according to David Hackett Fisher, one of those men, William Goff, was back in Massachusetts, living and hiding in the town of Hadley, his presence kept a secret even from most of the townsmen. During the war, Hadley came under attack from a band of Indians. Goffe, seeing their approach, raced out to the meeting house where the townsmen were assembled, crying out, "I will lead, follow me." They did. Goffe, who was now in his late 60s, took charge of an old cannon, firing it at the Native Americans and sending them fleeing. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished back into hiding, leaving the befuddled townsmen to wonder what sort of divine intervention had just saved them. Unfortunately, the rest of the war was less whimsical than that particular anecdote. Atrocities were committed on both sides. The Indians flayed people and cut captives apart piece by piece. Over the course of the war, 12 Puritan towns were completely destroyed and a full third of them had to be abandoned. When the town of Sudbury was hit by a surprise attack, almost 30 militiamen were killed. And the Puritans slaughtered Indians in great numbers. One such incident resembled the Mystic Massacre during the Pequot War. After an Indian fort was overrun, the survivors fled into a nearby swamp, where the New Englanders hunted them down. Again, hundreds of people, most of them non-combatants, were killed in what became known as the Great Swamp Fight. The fighting went back and forth, but the English eventually got the upper hand. Within a year or so, the Indians were pushed to the point of starvation, and Metacomet's forces slowly dwindled. In late 1676, some soldiers from Plymouth led a group of native warriors to hunt down King Philip. After several close escapes, Metacomet was finally killed in August, just 2 months before the death of Nathaniel Bacon. His body was dismembered and his severed head was placed atop a watchtower in Plymouth, where it became a tourist attraction for decades. His wife and young son were sold into slavery and never heard from again. This mostly ended the war, although fighting continued for a few more years up in Maine. Along with Metacomet's family, over 1,000 Indians, men, women, and children, were enslaved and shipped off to the Caribbean, a policy of purposeful ethnic cleansing. The war had been a disaster for both sides. Plymouth lost 8% of its residents, the most of any of the colonies. But the Indian population plummeted even further. Between death, enslavement, and refugees fleeing the region, the native population in New England had been reduced by over half in just a few years. According to Nathaniel Philbrick, quote, "There were approximately 70,000 people in New England at the outbreak of hostilities. By the end of the war, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 were dead, with more than 3/4 of those losses suffered by the Native Americans." In terms of percentage of population killed, King Philip's War was more than twice as bloody as the American Civil War, and at least 7 times more lethal than the American Revolution. And remember, disease had reduced the population by an even greater amount only a few decades ago. The war also marked the end of New England's unique relationship with the Indians. Whereas before the two peoples had been somewhat intermingled, afterwards the policy of the colonists was more like that of the English elsewhere in America, containing the Indians to small patches of land while the frontier moved ever westward. Harvard's Indian College was torn down, and even those tribes who had allied with the Puritans were in a worse position than before. Most of all, the demographic dominance of the Europeans was now total. But that didn't mean that the New Englanders were more in control of their own destiny. Far from it. There would still be major Indian wars throughout the next century, often launched with the backing of the French who had settled in Quebec a few hundred miles to the north. But more important was the loss of their autonomy from England. You'll recall that the English authorities took the opportunity of Bacon's rebellion to assert greater control over Virginia. Well, something similar was happening up north. In 1679, New Hampshire, which had been independent until its annexation by Massachusetts, was made independent again, as a royal colony controlled directly by the king. This was an attempt to weaken the power of Massachusetts. In the next decade, there was an attempt to abolish the colony's independence altogether, but we won't be getting to that for a while. Just know that the monarchy was tightening its grip up and down the coast. King Philip's War also increased the power of the provinces relative to the power of the towns. It was now clear that the defense of the colonies required greater centralization. While New England towns remain pretty independent even to this day, in a sense they had already passed their high water mark as separate centers of power. The Puritan way of life was already waning. The zeal was hardly gone, but it was weakened. Time, dissent, and the absence of real religious opponents had all taken their toll. Children were naturally less fervent than their parents. New arrivals came for economic rather than religious reasons. The power of the church lessened as the power of the secular state grew. The Salem witch trials of the 1690s would be a further shock. The old guard tried to hold the line, attributing the various calamities afflicting New England to this religious backsliding, but ultimately to no avail. The Puritans had built a new culture, yes, but it wouldn't stay a Puritan culture. Instead, New Englanders became Yankees. But that's for later episodes. In England itself, the Restoration proved to be a permanent defeat for the Puritans there. They were a spent force. But they weren't gone for good. The Puritan impulse was channeled into other nonconformist religious groups, like the Methodists, say, which would themselves have an impact on religious history. But that is definitely outside the scope of this podcast. I'd like to close this episode by summarizing the New England model of government as it existed from 1630 to the 1680s, when there were substantial changes. For comparison, and just as a reminder, the Chesapeake model of government was as follows. There was a governor who was appointed back in England, in Virginia by the king, and in Maryland by the Lord Proprietor. The governor then appointed men to serve in the upper legislative house. The lower house was elected first by the freemen, and later just by the freeholders of the colony. The lower house's approval was required for all taxation and legislation. Local government was entirely in the hands of appointed officials, who generally had to be informally approved by the notable men in their district. The delegates to the lower house were the only elected officials in the colony, and those elections weren't strongly contested. So on the whole, popular participation was only a moderately important part of government in the Chesapeake. The New England model, which was mostly based on how Massachusetts did things, was substantially more representative. Deputies, magistrates, governors, and deputy governors were all elected. Sometimes a few additional positions, such as treasurer and admiral at sea, were elected as well. Only Massachusetts had a fully bicameral legislature during this period, thanks to that runaway pig. Perhaps in the other, smaller colonies, there was just less of a difference between the deputies and the magistrates. But however they were divided up, a similar model where the governor was above the magistrates, who were above the deputies, prevailed. Local government, which was in the hands of towns rather than counties, was totally controlled by the popular will. The freemen of each town would meet and could pretty much do as they liked within reason. In practice, power was delegated to elected officials, such as the selectmen, but they served at the pleasure of the town. There were temporary factions rather than political parties, and elections weren't usually closely fought, but in times of discontent people could lose their offices. Voting was done by ballot rather than by show of hands or by voice, which was at least somewhat more secretive. There were often religious restrictions on voting, whether de facto, as in Connecticut, or de jure, as in Massachusetts. Church membership and religious propriety were both intimately tied up with political rights. I haven't mentioned it before, but it was possible to lose your status as a freeman, and hence the right to vote, for criminal or unseemly behavior. For instance, in Connecticut, you could even lose the right to vote for, quote, scandalous walking. Still, in such a religious society, many citizens did qualify as freemen, and overall, participation remained high, especially at the local level. So that's where things stood by the end of the 1670s. New England had created its own culture, one that would persist. Although the migration had stopped, the population kept growing. For one thing, the mortality rate was quite low thanks to the climate. Plus, the birth rate was one of the highest ever recorded in human history. In some towns, over 9 children per married woman. And that's average, remember, so half of the women would have had even more. Those 20,000 migrants grew into a population of nearly 100,000 by the end of the century, larger than in the Chesapeake. And that's compared to over 5 million in England. The American colonies were finally beginning to matter in their own right. And lucky for them, because they'll be facing their fair share of challenges over the next century. Phew, well, that's 6 out of the original 13 colonies down. We're almost halfway there. Next episode, we'll jump back down south for the creation of the unruly colony of North Carolina in the 1660s and 70s. So join me next time for Culpeper's Rebellion, here on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter, at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.